When it comes to topics of importance in the motor carrier industry, compliance, safety, accountability, or CSA, is at the top of the list. So, what is CSA and how does it affect you and your future as a professional driver? This course will help you answer this and many more questions on the topic. CSA, which stands for Compliance, Safety, Accountability, is a driver and carrier monitoring and evaluation system that is designed to identify and intervene with drivers and carriers who are not in compliance with safety regulations. It is implemented by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA. CSA applies to any interstate motor carrier that operates commercial motor vehicles, CMVs, and has a U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. DOT number. Any interstate or intrastate motor carrier that operates vehicles transporting hazardous materials, and all drivers who drive CMVs in interstate commerce. A CMV is defined in Section 390.5 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, or FMCSRs, as having a gross vehicle weight rating or gross combination weight rating, or gross vehicle weight or gross combination weight of 10,001 pounds or more, whichever is greater, or designed or used to transport more than 8 passengers, including the driver, for compensation, or designed or used to transport more than 15 passengers, including the driver, and is not used to transport passengers for compensation, or transporting hazardous materials in a type or quantity requiring placarding. Simply put, CSA is a system used by the FMCSA to identify safety problems early, so they can be addressed before they lead to tragedies on the highway. It addresses enforcement in a way that allows for contact with a larger number of motor carriers and drivers earlier in the safety evaluation process. This allows FMCSA to address problems before they become serious. In the past, FMCSA's enforcement system primarily focused on motor carriers and didn't place an emphasis on drivers. FMCSA believes that by tracking both motor carriers and drivers, the agency has a more complete picture of compliance. The first component in the CSA system is data collection. FMCSA uses 3 data sources to gather information about motor carrier and driver compliance: roadside inspections, law enforcement crash reports, and FMCSA investigations. The roadside inspection is where the majority of data about motor carriers and drivers is gathered. The roadside inspection is an examination of both the driver and his or her CMV by law enforcement. This examination determines if the driver and his or her vehicle are in compliance with the FMCSRs and hazardous materials regulations. Data collection takes place during all roadside inspections, such as those at weigh stations or ones that occur as a result of moving violations. Violations found during the roadside inspection are entered into the system. When no violations are found, that is also entered into the system. All state-reported crashes involving a CMV are entered into a database and eventually scored, even if the driver wasn't at fault or could not have prevented the crash. Finally, if a carrier is targeted for investigation by the FMCSA, any unreported safety-related data discovered during this process may also be added to the database. The second component of the CSA system is the Safety Measurement System, SMS. The SMS quantifies the on-road safety performance and compliance history of motor carriers and drivers to identify candidates for interventions, determine the specific safety problems exhibited by a driver or motor carrier, and monitor whether safety problems are getting worse. Every month, the SMS measures roadside violation and crash data performance and calculates a score in the 7 behavior analysis and safety improvement categories, basics. Motor carriers are measured on the previous 24 months and drivers are measured on the previous 36 months. The behavior analysis and safety improvement categories, basics, are 7 categories of safety behaviors measured in the SMS. The basics are behaviors that can lead to crashes. Knowing what the 7 basics are, how they are scored, and what those scores can mean for you and your carrier is very important. Like the other basics, this has nothing to do with receiving a citation or ticket for operating under the influence while driving your personal vehicle. For a controlled substance or alcohol violation to become part of the SMS, recorded under this basic, it must be noted by a trained officer in a roadside inspection report or during a carrier investigation. Examples of violations that fall under this basic include operating under the influence of alcohol or drugs, possession of drugs or alcohol in a CMV, possession, use, or under the influence of alcohol within 4 hours prior to duty, and violating an alcohol or drug-related out-of-service order. For drivers, staying on the good side of this basic is pretty simple. Don't operate a vehicle under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Misuse of illegal, prescription, or even over-the-counter medications can affect driving abilities. The regulations prohibit you from drinking any alcohol for at least 4 hours before your shift begins. In fact, the regulations prohibit having any alcohol whatsoever with you in the CMV, even on open purchases you intend for personal use later. To avoid on-the-road problems in this area, your carrier may choose to establish and enforce policies that are stricter than the regulations mandate. For example, drivers might be required to be alcohol-free for 12 or 24 hours before coming on duty rather than the regulations' minimum 4 hours. Carriers do this because if there is an investigation, the presence of such a policy sends a clear signal to the FMCSA that the carrier is serious about the controlled substances and alcohol basic. Unsafe driving addresses the operation of CMVs by drivers in a dangerous or careless manner. Examples of violations that fall under this basic include speeding, reckless driving, improper lane change, following too closely, not using your seatbelt, and texting while driving. These types of violations often trigger roadside inspections, so steering clear of moving violations is a key strategy for minimizing roadside inspections. If the FMCSA has determined the driver could have avoided, prevented, or stopped the violation, the driver is considered the responsible party and the violation is entered into the driver's data, as well as the carrier's data in the SMS. However, if the driver receives a warning, citation, or a ticket that's issued by an officer who has not entered it on a roadside inspection report, there is no entry into the SMS. Only data on roadside inspection reports submitted by trained officers becomes part of the CSA database. The unsafe driving basic includes some of the more serious violations tracked by the CSA. The best approach to ensure a low score in this basic is to avoid driving violations, especially high-severity violations. Practice defensive driving. Keep yourself fresh and alert to prevent poor driving decisions, and take advantage of any training programs your carrier offers. Examples of violations that fall under this basic include operating a CMV while ill or fatigued, hours of service violations, and record of duty status violations. Understanding how and when to complete a record of duty status is one of the key elements of the Hours of Service Compliance Basic. You can avoid violations by thoroughly understanding the Hours of Service regulations, by keeping your record of duty status with you, and by keeping it accurate, truthful, and up to date. And, of course, don't drive if you are ill or fatigued, out of hours, or if you've received an out-of-service order. Proper vehicle maintenance is paramount to safety, and some vehicle maintenance issues have a considerable bearing on crash causation. Examples of violations that fall under this basic include defective brakes, lights, and other mechanical components, failure to make required repairs, failure to inspect the vehicle or prepare inspection reports, improper load securement, and operating an out-of-service vehicle. The obvious way to keep your score low for this basic is to make sure you complete all required vehicle inspections and cargo checks, know what to do when on-road repairs are needed, and know of and use proper cargo securement techniques. Finally, make sure you report any problems to your carrier immediately so they can be addressed. Contrary to what you might assume about the name of this basic, driver fitness does not refer to the physical fitness of drivers. The driver fitness basic uses violations noted in roadside inspections that are associated with the driver training, driver qualifications, and driver licensing as related to the types of vehicles drivers operate and the loads they transport. Examples of violations that fall under this basic include failure to have a valid and/or appropriate license, failure to have proper endorsements, failure to have valid medical certification, and failure to train hazmat employees. Since driver qualifications and training are key elements of this basic, you can ensure a low score by being properly licensed and trained, and by keeping your training current. If your job involves transporting hazardous materials, be sure you've received the training you need to be qualified to carry these loads. You should always have a valid license of the correct class with the necessary endorsements for the type of truck and type of load you are transporting. And every driver should be able to pass a physical exam, so you should have current medical certification on file with your driver licensing agency at all times. The Hazardous Materials, or HM Compliance Basic, addresses the unsafe handling of hazardous materials on a CMV. As a driver, your key responsibilities in this area are to make sure that any hazardous materials you transport have been properly packaged, labeled, and documented before they are loaded on your vehicle. You also need to make sure that hazardous materials are properly secured and that hazmat paperwork is where it should be in the cab. Examples of violations include leaking containers, improper placarding, failure to have proper hazmat documentation, and hazmat routing violations. The surest path to prevent violations in the Hazardous Materials Compliance Basic is knowledge. Knowledge gained by understanding the regulations related to transporting hazardous materials, and knowledge gained by inspecting your load and taking action when you identify a problem. CSA is designed to prevent crashes, so it's not surprising that monitoring crash events is a critical part of the SMS. Unlike the other 6 basics, which each relate to a specific category of behavior, the Crash Indicator Basic collects data on one of the more extreme consequences of unsafe driving behaviors. The Crash Indicator Basic uses state-generated crash reports to add data points to both the driver's and the carrier's SMS record. It's important to note that under the current system, all crashes are recorded. It doesn't matter who was at fault. If you're involved in a crash while operating a CMV, even as a victim, that crash will become part of the SMS database. However, crashes used for this measure include only recordable crashes, those that result in a fatality, an injury requiring immediate treatment away from the scene, or requiring vehicles to be towed from the scene due to disabling damage. To avoid being involved in a crash, you need to drive defensively, operate within the traffic rules and regulations, and anticipate the actions of other drivers on the road. And it means training. Upgrading and refreshing your skills on a regular basis is an effective way to avoid involvement in a crash. To make sure the comparisons that occur as part of the safety evaluation process are applied fairly, all safety-related violations are given numerical values, which are ultimately used to generate scores for both the carrier and driver measurement systems. Each safety-related event is assigned to one of the 7 basics. It then receives a number value, called a severity weight, between 1 and 10, with 10 being the most severe. This number value is based on the violation's seriousness in relation to causing a crash. The higher the severity weight, the more likely the carrier and driver will be in a crash based on statistics. Examples of low severity weight violations include a general form and manner violation on your record of duty status, a defective inoperative windshield wiper on your vehicle, and not carrying spare fuses on your vehicle when required. Examples of high severity weight violations include a false record of duty status, no or improper load securement, violating an out-of-service order, and use or possession of drugs. It's important to note that 4 of the 7 basics have an out-of-service penalty, or kicker. This penalty applies to the hours of service compliance, driver fitness, vehicle maintenance, and hazardous materials compliance basics. Anytime a driver is ordered out of service for a violation that is placed in one of these basics, the violation severity is increased by 2. So, if the violation originally had a severity weight of 7 and the driver was placed out of service, the severity weight for the violation is increased to 9. As well as receiving a severity weight value between 1 and 10, safety-related events are also time-weighted. This is a way of putting more emphasis on recent violations than on past violations. For drivers, if the violation occurred within the previous 12 months, the time weight is 3. Within 12 to 24 months, the time weight is 2. And within 24 to 36 months, the time weight is 1. Using this method, the value of each violation diminishes over time and is eliminated after 36 months. For carriers, the time weights for safety data are different. The previous 6 months, the time weight is 3. Within 6 to 12 months, the time weight is 2. And within 12 to 24 months, the time weight is 1. These 2 data points, severity weighting and time weighting, are multiplied together to give a result called the full value of the violation. Again, some violations are scored against both the driver and the carrier, but some violations are scored against the carrier only. When the full values of all violations in certain basics are added together and the FMCSA applies statistical tools, the result is a number that can be used for a fair comparison among drivers and carriers. It bears emphasizing that this number is not the score. To reach the score, drivers and carriers measured within each basic are compared to similar drivers and carriers. The safety evaluation is the third component in the CSA system. For carriers, the comparison process starts by dividing carriers into safety event groups, also referred to as peer groups, based on the number of violations, inspections, or crashes the carrier has had in the last 2 years. The driver process is similar in most basics, except that in the unsafe driving and crash indicator basics, drivers are all in one large safety event group. Within each safety event group, drivers and carriers are given a percentile ranking, and it's this percentile rank that is the basic score. The carrier or driver with the best measure receives a percentile rank of 0, while the carrier or driver with the worst measure receives a percentile rank of 100. If one or more of the basic percentiles exceed a threshold, the carrier or driver becomes a candidate for an intervention. Interventions are the fourth component in the CSA system. Interventions are actions FMCSA can take against a motor carrier and driver based on safety measurement scores and enforcement history. Motor carrier interventions can be triggered by one or more deficient basics, a high crash rate, a complaint, or a fatal crash. Intervention selection is influenced by safety performance, whether the motor carrier transports hazardous materials or passengers, and intervention history. Interventions that are applied to carriers are designed to be progressive, increasing in severity as more serious safety issues are identified. Interventions include warning letters, advising of apparent safety problems and the potential consequences, targeted roadside inspections to verify the issues covered in the warning letters are being addressed and corrected, off-site investigations involving the collection and reviewing of documents without sending an FMCSA investigator to the motor carrier's place of business, focused on-site investigations at the carrier's place of business, focusing on a particular safety problem, comprehensive on-site investigations conducted at the carrier's place of business when a carrier exhibits broad and complex safety problems through multiple deficient basics, cooperative safety plans developed and followed voluntarily by a carrier to address safety problems after an investigation, notices of violation, which put a carrier on notice of specific, serious regulatory violations that must be corrected, and the intent of the FMCSA to enforce its regulations. Notices of claim, which include a formal document served on the violator to compel compliance, and deter severe or persistent unsafe behavior. Settlement agreements to contractually bind a carrier to take actions to improve safety, and unfit suspensions to place the motor carrier out of business. Currently, this process can only be used as part of a compliance review. If your carrier is subject to an intervention due to a high basic score, the FMCSA will review all of the carrier's drivers looking for high scores. If the investigation confirms significant driver violations, the FMCSA can take action against drivers, such as a notice of violation or a notice of claim. These actions could result in significant fines for the identified drivers. As you can see, your actions or inactions can play a huge part in the scoring of both you and your motor carrier under CSA. So, how do you ensure positive scores? Since the majority of data will be gathered during roadside inspections, it is important to have roadside inspections with no violations. As part of the CSA initiative, FMCSA has been working to make accurate and timely information about motor carriers and drivers available to the industry. As a new driver who will be applying for work with motor carriers in the near future, it is important that you are aware of and understand one of these initiatives, FMCSA's Pre-Employment Screening Program, or PSP. PSP allows motor carriers to electronically access driver inspection and crash records as part of the hiring process. Drivers must give their written consent before records may be released to a motor carrier. Records will be protected in accordance with federal privacy laws. Drivers may also access this data to verify its accuracy and correct any discrepancies. If you feel a violation was wrong, was assigned to you in error, or is otherwise incorrect, there is an appeal process you can pursue. Appeals are handled through an FMCSA web portal called DataQueues. You will have to sign up for a DataQueue account, which is free, to challenge any incorrect data in the system. The information provided includes the most recent 5 years of crash data and 3 years of roadside inspection data from FMCSA's Motor Carrier Management Information System, or MCMIS. MCMIS is comprised of driver data including inspection and compliance review results, enforcement data, state-reported crashes, and motor carrier census data. FMCSA states that by accessing this data, motor carriers will be able to better assess the potential safety risks of prospective driver employees. You should now be able to discuss the goal of the Compliance Safety Accountability System, list the 4 major components of the CSA system, describe the 7 behavior analysis and safety improvement categories, basic scores, and strategies for keeping your basic scores low, and recognize actions that can be taken by the FMCSA in an intervention. Now it's time to take the course exam. This exam includes 10 questions. Be aware, if you close the exam before finishing, your answers will not be saved. You may take this exam more than once. Your highest score will be reported. To begin the course exam, select Next.